I want to explain a little bit about my wheelchair because it's a very big part of my teaching this morning. But additionally, let's get really comfortable with me working from a laptop. I feel strange about that, and I tried to do and think about all the things and the way people prepare messages, but I kept coming back to me. This is how I am best going to be able to communicate what the Lord has put on my heart, and that is what is so important to me in this moment. It is such an honor to be bringing the word, and again, I just can't get away from the word honor. Like the Lord has really prepared a beautiful message alongside our family and my personal journey over about a year and a half time. And so this is a very, very dear and beautiful message that I've just been so excited to share. And I have some wonderful family and friends here today too that bring me so much joy. And I'm going to try my hardest not to make eye contact with my husband because he's wonderful and is going to make me smile and giggle. And I've already been instructed, don't giggle and talk at the same time because that's a problem. But anyways, if you can't tell, we are technical arts kinds of people. We spend a lot of time in the back, my husband and I, and lo and behold, look at me here in the front. This is not my comfort zone, right? I'm typically in that back corner, and we're typically creative in that sound booth, and we love it. We love it tremendously because we can bring beautiful things together and cater to a worship experience. So anyways, I'm going to dive in. But I had mentioned, the wheelchair pieces and raising up. And I depend on this because I have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed at 17 years old and met my husband a year later. So he's been a very big part of my journey with MS. And as Shelby said, we met on MySpace, which is honestly a wonderful thing because our foundation of our relationship was based on communication, very deep communication. And so it's been beautiful to flourish in that avenue with him. But and thank you, Shelby, for pointing that out. She can make everybody seem like the coolest person, right? And I don't feel that cool, but she does a great job. But reflecting on the past 20 years, I'm amazed at what has been accomplished in my life so far. Regardless of my illness, I have met all of my educational goals, my career goals, my family goals, but it was not easy. A lot of strain, a lot of fatigue I deal with every day, and so it was never easy by any means. And MS is a progressive disease, so it only I don't want to say it gets worse, it just changes. It changes every day. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But when I was diagnosed, I looked so much different. When I met Brad, I looked so much different. I felt different. Meaning we hiked, we scuba dove, we did all the adventurous things. We love being outdoors. We enjoyed everything that would push our bodies harder, and I did them all. But the thing about it is I don't have longevity in that body, and my body doesn't always keep up with that now. But the biggest impact in our life was 12 years ago. In 2012, our life changed within a week's time, no lie. I woke up on a Monday morning, stumbled, wall walked. That's a MS term. If you touch something, you can apparently walk suddenly. Like, you can walk much better if you're touching a wall. So I wall walked a lot, and that morning, wall walked to the bathroom and hit the ground. So Monday morning, I went into work. It was like, I think I probably broke something. Went to the doctor. I did. But I didn't go back to work. I remember by Wednesday telling my boss that, I don't feel too comfortable coming back to work without getting a walker. And so we started pressing forward with figuring out how to get a walker in our life. And then by Friday, I remember calling my boss up again, and I'm like, hey, look, these legs are just not responding, period. I'm not going to be able to come to work without like an actual wheelchair. And so within a week's time, I went from walking and able on Monday morning to paralyzed from the waist down. And so I don't tell you these things for pity. That I am at a place I really want to share these stories, and I just want you to understand where I'm coming from, because it's going to lay a foundation for what I'm speaking about today. But also that, again, MS, multiple sclerosis, is a progressive disease, and I don't know what my future looks like. That's an open canvas. But it's even more daunting that when I decided to step away from the workforce in 2023, that's all I knew was my career. But we as a family, we knew it was necessary. It was time. I couldn't keep up the demands of my role anymore, and I was seeing that. And with anything I do, I wanted to be excellent, and I just didn't feel like I was able to deliver that anymore in that avenue. So me stepping away from the workforce wasn't just for me either. You can imagine having a chronic illness, as I do, is a strain on the family, mental health-wise as well. So we did this mental health practice in our home too. Our dog included, like she is an actual member of our family. In fact, we had a conversation about like why I couldn't bring her today because she needed to witness this. Anyways, I mean, we just collectively as a family looked at our mental health as a whole, and everything, absolutely everything, kept coming back to me in the work environment. Me traveling, I was at a point where I was traveling. I would drive to Central Texas, and it was so exhausting to do just the drive, an 8-hour work day. I was staying in hotels just to compensate for the amount of rest I needed to recover. So in those moments, us being broken up as a family was hard on our daughter, hard on my husband. I mean, why not the dog? Like, I keep track of her food schedule. That's my responsibility. But anyways, we just, as a whole, we're finding that everything, absolutely everything, that was a struggle in our home came back to me working. So it was like, what was I pressuring and putting all this effort in for? But anyways, when I transitioned out of the work environment, I just very quickly realized I had no idea who the heck I was. I found a lot of purpose in my career, and this was just a wilderness season. I did not know what I was doing, who I was, like what I was supposed to be doing. Like, I didn't even know what I was supposed to be talking about with people. Like, I always asked people, like, how's the job? And here's what's going on. I was so lost. But another realization is that I had never grieved my diagnosis. And so I was diagnosed at 17, hit the ground running, immediately jumped in the workforce, got my education in tandem to working, and started a family. I never looked at that moment in my life, and I started to really see I had a lot to grieve with my diagnosis in those moments as well. And then additionally, I was finding that I had distracted myself so well with all the workday to-dos and preparation, weekend recovery prep. I had never, ever identified with who I was outside of a work environment. But also was inviting wonderful friends over for coffee. And I think one of the things I said to Christina last weekend was she likely has seen like an evolution in me as I've grown in this season. And I've been so lucky to be able to invite ladies over for coffee and enjoy the quiet, lonely moments I had during this season. And I've just been so blessed for those people to speak life into me. But the thing that these ladies likely never knew in those moments was I was so uncomfortable, at least initially, because I wasn't really confident I even knew how to be a friend. I had been a coworker for so long, and I didn't have the energy for job recovery prep weekend prep for the job. Like, I just never had time for that personal space or creating my own personal community. So that was very uncomfortable for me in the beginning to really figure out, like, how do you be a friend, and how, that even exchange of a relationship. So, I mean, it was a growing season of really, who am I? Additionally, I found myself really striving for a closer relationship with God. I have been so blessed to work in environments where I was able to, or it was encouraged to have a relationship with Christ, and really emphasize on that. And I shared devotionals with my team. I read the scriptures related to those devotionals, but I didn't really personally feel like I had my own relationship with Christ. And so that was something that was so dear to me in those moments that I wanted to develop and get in the Word more. So today, right, we're going to talk about my journey through the experience, or through the wilderness and this experience. But I want you to take note and listen for those things that I think are going to be quite relatable with my story. I know mine is very leaned towards who am I and this very unfamiliar world that I live in, because every day is unfamiliar for me. But we're going to get into a little bit more of that. But just some little housekeeping items that you're going to need. You've got 2 index cards that you should have gotten at some point. If you didn't get 2 index cards, I've got some youth that are willing to help pass those out, because we're going to do some ministerial exercises at the end. And what that's going to look like is I want, as we're gathering those things, I want you to take one of those cards, and just the things that rattle around in your brain this morning that are distracting you from your relationship with Christ, or the things that are giving you anxiety, constantly burdening you, the things that you feel like you fix your mind on rather than the Word. I want you to jot down. I mean, could be just something personal to you, but I also want you to use the other note card to kind of keep a personal note for yourself. One of those is going to be for you to take home and continue to press in, but you may end up with the same things on both cards, and that's kind of the idea. Is we're going to do a ministerial exercise with one, so we're going to release that, but I want you to still have one for your own time at home. And I'm going to position myself a little bit over here, because I feel like these folks over here are getting on me. So, okay. I'm sorry? Yeah. All right. I think we got all our cards ready. So, all right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the traditional parts that you might expect from a message coming from Exodus. And I'm going to rapid fire a lot of scriptures here. For whatever reason, it's very important to have biblical backing to everything that I say. It's just a comfort thing for me when presenting. So I'm going to rapid fire a lot of scriptures, but please know that the most important ones are going to be on the screen behind me. So you have that to follow along with. I know my note takers would love to know that. I'm one of them. But what we see in most of our movies and events today are Moses confronting the Pharaoh, right? In Exodus 7:16, God says, tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, and he's telling the Pharaoh, right? He has sent me to tell you, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But so far you have not listened, speaking to the Pharaoh. Emphasis on worship me in the wilderness, right? We're going to come back to that. And then Exodus 8, God says, let my people go yet again so that they may worship me. And then the Bible tells us that because of the Pharaoh's hard heart, the plagues are initiated. Even after 10 plagues, the Pharaoh's heart is still hard, and then he does this switcheroo thing where he gives in, he lets the people go, and then he changes his mind, right? Like a nasty Pharaoh would do. It's what you would see the villains do in a Disney movie, is change their mind and make the worst out of the situation. But we know how the story goes. The Israelites did end up fleeing, and God was so tender to the Israelites in those moments. He truly understood their different needs, their different beliefs in those moments. In Exodus 13:17, you even witnessed the Lord navigating the Israelites around certain cities because he knew if they faced that city, they would face war. Again, putting them in a miserable situation. And so he was just so delicate to assure that everybody's needs were embraced. And at this point, Moses is beginning to embrace his purpose and his leadership. And I love Moses' story as well, and his, not resistance, but just, we just talked about it a moment ago, his anxiety towards this situation. I loved it because as being a previous leader, I know what that feels like. I know what it's like going into situations like thinking, okay, I'm the boss, but I'm scared. But I have to do this because, it's my job. But so I could feel Moses' hesitancy. And, we get to a place where he begins to embrace his purpose and his leadership. And he's speaking in Exodus 14:13-4, responding to the Israelites, telling them, don't be afraid and stand firm and see that the Lord's salvation, that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you're never going to see them again, as he's leading them out. And then he says, the Lord will fight for you. You must be quiet. And in this moment, this scripture is sort of amusing to me because I have quite the imagination, and I read this as though, Moses is telling them, like, look, guys, you just need to shut up because look what has happened so far. Like, we've come a long way already, and you're still just whining about it, right? So I imagine Moses being very frustrated at this point, especially being a new leader in such unknown and uncharted territory. I imagine his anxiety was flaring at that moment, and he was probably raging with, you better shut up because look how great this is going. But then we arrive at another theatrical moment where the Lord parts the Red Sea, and the Israelites get to witness this wonderful power. They get to see him once more. And again, keep in mind, there's no longer a fear of the Egyptians at this point. It's null and void. We've parted the Red Seas, and they've all been destroyed there. And the Lord bundles up that moment and wraps that gift in like the most stunning bow. And he says in Exodus 19:4 that you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you out on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Again, brought you to myself. So now that we have arrived in the wilderness, we're here, right? We're going to linger here. We're going to stay in the wilderness with the Lord. But it's in the wilderness that the laws, the restrictions, rest is outlined, his promises are outlined, In Exodus 23:33, in referral to the idols that the Israelites struggled with, the Lord says that they must not remain in your land, speaking of idols, or else they will make you sin against me. If you serve their gods, it will be a snare for you. And the Lord instructs them to separate from the wicked. But I think it's interesting that he compares the distractions to a snare. And I know many of you in this room don't get to see rehearsal here. But it starts around 8 generally, maybe 7:30 when my husband gets here. But anyways, there's a practice that happens where they test microphones. I'm going to use some words I don't even understand. Like my husband's like, don't do it, man. EQing, mixing. There's a whole lot of technical things that happen. But my point is when they get to the drums, it gets a little obnoxious and annoying. The snare being one of, this is by any means not to degrade the situation, because don't they make beautiful things happen by the time you guys arrive? But the prep to that, right? The snare can be the most god-awful sound sometimes. Like, it is so annoying, especially when you're like trying to focus on your little task and to do, and you just hear the tapping of a snare over and over and over. And can you adjust that mic? And oh no, let me run back there and do it. Anyways, you get my drift. It can be the loudest and most annoying distraction. So I find it rather interesting that the Lord compares a distraction to that of a snare. So remember that. But Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they all cover the intricate work of God in the wilderness. And if you've read these 4 books in chronological order, you likely have found yourself super frustrated. Because isn't it like over and over and over and over with the rules, right? And there's an S word I can't say. I'll get to that. Rules and ordinances, and it's just over and over. But what you also see in tandem to that, if you read the 4 books in chronological order, is you get to see how the Lord adjusts the laws for the poor. He adjusts the laws for women. He adjusts the laws for special circumstances. There's so many things that he adjusts simply to draw the Israelites back to him. And I love it. I love what I was seeing, because I did this a lot in my career and could relate back to it. But he was meeting them exactly where they were in those moments. And I mean, I could relate with that, because I use that term a lot in my career, and meaning that my team, I knew everybody on my team received information differently, had different things going on at home. So I always tried to cater to those things and make sure I was accounting for those things as I was working with them. But I saw the Lord doing this as well, as he was so delicately leading them through the wilderness. But there's not one detail that he left without consideration in those moments. Civil laws were created in the wilderness, which governed the nations and were there to address crimes. Ceremonial laws, which address clean versus unclean. And moral laws, which are outlined in our 10 Commandments. And when you think about the Israelites, like, it's much like a parent and a child. Like, what we are teaching our children as a mother, I know, and I communicate these things to my child, is I don't expect you to know these things at your age. Like, it's my job, it's my role to teach you these things. The Egyptians were right there. They had been in slavery for so long. They had no idea how to behave, how to act, even hygiene. Like, these weren't things that were known. And then in Exodus 20:22, he says that you are to keep all of my ordinances and do them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live will not vomit you out. And he additionally continues to encourage the people that he has set them apart. These were not rules for punishment, but this was discipline. Again, much like a parent-child relationship, it was so easy for me to relate to this. But it was applied individually, these ordinances and the discipline, but also it was preparing them for the promised land. God had prepared them so much for the promised land during the wilderness, and he used everyone. And by this point, some clans, like the Levites, had made very poor decisions and had forced themselves into a minority. But in God's perfect plan, everyone had a purpose. Every Israelite had a purpose. We're human, right? And the Lord created us all with the ability to make decisions and to think about worldly things freely. But I also believe he gives us a very clear direction on how we are to handle our hiccups. Because we're ever so delicately disciplined, right? Just like the Israelites. And unknowing to them, he was curating a relationship with him and preparing them for the next season in life. But it was something that was so much better, and it was more than they could have even imagined. And the Ten Commandments, I mentioned over and over and over, right? The Ten Commandments were in Exodus 20 and again in Deuteronomy 5. They provide the framework for some of our basic rules today. And if you want to go ahead and put that up there, Kim, I believe that, if we detach ourselves from some of this, or not some, all sin distractions, there's a basis to draw us closer to him. So I've displayed all the 10 Commandments for you because I want you to draw your own conclusion on that idea, on where those fit. But we're going to spend the rest of our time this morning on Exodus 20:17, which is, do not covet your neighbor's house, do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And I'm going to take a short moment to confess that, I generally, with the 10 Commandments, I've always looked at all of them as, I don't plan on murdering anybody. It just looked like a lot of rules, right? That applied to me, but weren't really things that burdened me. And so then we get to 10, right? And I looked at that more of like adultery or infidelity, because I saw like husband, wife, servant, and just ran on, perused by. So I don't know if any of you have looked at the 10 Commandments in the same way, but that's really where I in the past had found myself. But in this new season of my life and really pressing in on the 10 Commandments, I truly begin to understand that we're not meant to be distracted by the things that are of our neighbors, the things our friends have, the qualities that people possess, the luxuries that some people possess. In my case, the abilities that people have, the resources available to somebody. But this was really speaking to me, and how we as humans so easily want to compare ourselves to others. We want to covet the things of others. We feel like we deserve those things. And sometimes, like me, I'm like, I'm young. I have a lot of life to live. Like this, I deserve much more than this life, right? But it's so easy to fall into that rut. And I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, isn't God's plan so much better, though, than the rut that we mentally create? Exodus 12:40 tells us that the Israelites were slaves for 430 years. Yet in the wilderness, they grumbled, they complained, they even wanted to return after being set free from slavery. Like, all these generations lived in slavery. They coveted the past. They coveted what they had, which was so much worse. Come on, who wants to go and be in slavery? But they also coveted ease. They wanted ease over freedom. What was comfortable and what was easy? Isn't that relatable? We just want to be comfortable and nestle into that. And honestly, their leader, we talked a little bit about their leader, Moses. He subtly set the tone for that, because in Exodus 3 and 4, he was also complaining and arguing with God. He goes back and forth until he finally accepts the fact that he's going to free the people. But my point is he too was not wanting to be uncomfortable and not wanting to be challenged. He was resistant to that. But the thing about it is unknowingly, they all avoided their purpose in those moments. But life happens, right? Life continues regardless of our mental state and wherever we find ourselves, and there's no exception to that. We know that. There's a lot of longevity in this room, but in my case, it's visible. But I can guarantee that every single one of you is experiencing something that's life-altering, right? And what I've found is, what I feel like is worst-case scenario in my life, every single person is living that worst-case scenario moment. Theirs just looks a little bit different than mine. And again, mine's on the outside. Everybody sees what I'm encountering, but either way, it's a distraction. And it makes you feel like you're in the most chaotic situation. And unfortunately for some, you find yourself questioning God's intentions, or maybe even your interest in continuing your relationship with Christ. In Deuteronomy 8:5, Moses says, "Keep in mind that the Lord your God is disciplining you, just as man disciplines his son." So with that scripture, we must understand that God disciplines us, just as he did the Israelites through the wilderness, but he doesn't punish us. I think that's one thing in the moments we feel like God's not intervening for us. But he's using all these moments to discipline us, to prepare us. And I believe it's pertinent to acknowledge when you are in the wilderness. Recognizing this alone brings a sense of awareness to your spirit, but it also prepares your heart for the journey. In Deuteronomy 10:16, Moses says, "Therefore circumcise your hearts and don't be stiff-necked any longer." In other words, we're hard-headed. We're hard-headed people. And we must be transformed. Circumcising your hearts, it seems like such a physical action, but it's spiritual. It's mental. It's a full transformation. And additionally, notice, and I emphasize this, it is your responsibility. It is our responsibility to acknowledge that. We have to put the effort in. We have to put the effort in and embrace the wilderness. And as I previously mentioned, I stepped away from the workforce. Did not have a clear path defined. It was a very scary moment. We're very careful planners financially. And in many, many elements of our life. And so this was an unknown. And we knew in that aspect, I knew in that aspect, we were going to be walking in the wilderness for quite some time. And quite some time, meaning we just didn't know. We didn't know what finances were going to look like. I didn't know who I was going to be in this new season. I didn't know what I was going to do with my time. But it hit me so rapidly how lost I was. And I also knew that I did not want to be stagnant. When I stopped working, I didn't want to just sit there and be the girl that withered away and in the wheelchair. And I didn't want to be a waste. I didn't want to be a waste of a viable resource in God's kingdom. I I knew in those moments that I wasn't going to be that person, and I had to figure this out and what that was going to look like. And then my husband's amazing. He's the one that wears sunglasses on his head all the time, so you can find him. But he's awesome. He honestly would do anything for me and makes me smile in every moment. Is the most forgiving individual, but the most loving person you will ever meet in your life. And has so much grace for me in my moments. And he's truly amazing and a wonderful man. Smart as all get out. But I knew I wanted to honor him in this season because everything had magnified my career in our household. And so in so many ways, I didn't feel like I ever had the ability to honor my daughter or my husband. And so that's where I first invested really everything I had. I kept our house pristine. I made sure meals were on the table. All the laundry was always done. Like, it was like a hotel. Like, I wanted him to know that the decision that we made for me to be home wasn't just a waste, and I wasn't gonna, I like this, I use a term today, melt in my recliner. So I wasn't just gonna melt in my recliner and not provide to our household. So that's where I found my self-worth at that time. And that was initially, my self-worth was all in my career, and then I didn't know anything after that. I didn't know who I was. So I transitioned that to, okay, if my family can just see that I'm more than a paycheck, they'll see my worth in these moments. But additionally, I had a car. A lot of you know about the car. If you're church family or family, you have experienced my car. The bottom line is I'm in a lemon right now, and there's not an easy way around that when you're in a van that's accessible only for you. But anyways, we had a lot of car problems leading up to that, and while I was working, we were never comfortable parting with it to put it in the shop. So we just band-aided. And so when I quit working, it was time. We put her in the shop and lost her for 9 months. And that was hard. Again, I was at home already, and then slap that on, like 7 to 5, this girl was alone, home with her emotions, struggling to figure out who the heck I was, putting everything I had into cleaning and making sure the house was just like perfect. So it was wilderness, y'all. Like it was very much so the wilderness. Probably needed to be in therapy, but again, I was not going to burden my husband with an additional task or need that I don't have a car. He was going to have to do the work to get me there. So I tried to stay as I'm going to say low. I just want to say under the radar would be a better word. I stayed under the radar. I didn't want to be an additional nuisance, right? And I found my self-worth in what I could provide to my family. And as I've mentioned, I would have friends over for coffee, but I definitely carried myself differently then because I didn't know who I was. And I was so heartbroken about my career and everything that was tangled up in that. And the thing about it is my career, to me, when I look back, it was quite a bit of facade. You know the term fake it till you make it? I faked it every day. Like, that's how I felt. I worked so hard to make other people feel comfortable around the director that was in a wheelchair. I worked really hard to make sure they understood that this wheelchair didn't hold me back and that my mind was still worthy to provide in the environments that I was in. And really, it was a lot of work. And when you fake it all the time, it's rather exhausting when you come home to and can come down from that facade. But I talk about it today as if I was on stage. I had to perform. I had to get on stage every morning when I left for work. I had to dress the right way. I had to present the right way. I was always very careful with my words. I mean, everything was on a platform, and I was on stage. And so I maintained that idea for 18 years. By the time I stepped away from my career, I had so much anxiety because of all of the emotions I carried around with being on stage and setting myself up for that. But stepping away from work, I really began to see things from a different perspective. And in the solitude, I began to recognize that the beliefs I had, and my family's here, and I'm going to say a very churchy word, where a lot of them were stemming from generational things, generational influences, and I was really recognizing generational curses. It was a really deep self-discovery time in the wilderness, and in tandem to having deeper conversations with my mom, my grandmother. It just was so evident that there was more to the story, right? But I began to unveil memories that I had pressed down and forgotten. Overall, I mean, it was a very healing process that I wasn't even aware I needed. And it really opened my eyes on how important it is to evaluate what has and what is influencing you. Your sins impact others, and others' sins impact you. Vice versa. So how you were raised and what you know doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's biblical. It's just familiar. Much like the Israelites, the past was familiar to them. In Numbers 12:15, it says, Miriam was shut out from the camp for 7 days, and the people did not journey until Miriam was brought back in. So Miriam was Aaron and Moses' sister. So again, I could relate really well to this. I'm the oldest of 3. And I could just imagine, them in the corner whispering about a sibling. And what they're whispering about is who Moses decided to marry. They're, being all judgy in the corner, right? And anyways, so I have a very big imagination when I read. But anyways, leading up to that confinement, that's what was occurring. So the Lord was angered by this, and rather than killing her, again, he had a lot of flexibility here. Rather than killing her, he disciplined her with a skin disease. And that meant being confined outside the camp for 7 days. And the thing about that is it impacted everyone. So instead of the Israelites being able to move forward to a different location, they were stuck there. They had to wait for 7 days. And it seems like such a minor situation. But her choices, their choices, it delayed everyone. It impacted everyone. And again, I've mentioned, I'm very blessed to have my family here. And I have a very young family. And what I mean by that is they started early, pretty much. But that's how I always word it is I have a very young family. And I'm very blessed in all the things that make me up today, because it's really been the investment of my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my mom. I was very blessed to have a young family that allowed me to spend a lot of time with great-grandparents. That's very uncommon. The more I talk to people, I learn that. But and they were my babysitters. I was the kid that spent summers in the back of a car throwing newspapers with my grandpa, listening to AM country. I was also spending lots of time at a beauty shop with my grandmother. I spent lots of time on holidays with her. So and honestly, now that I'm saying all these things, I'm like, this is where my love for people came from. Like, I had all these wonderful moments. But, and fun fact, this isn't even in my notes. I mentioned about AM radio. I did not know that there was other genres of music other than country until I was like in junior high. And I'm like, wait, there's more out there? Because I thought country was just it. But my point being, I spent a lot of time with my relatives, and and even in the moments where I moved into the setting where I had to start using the wheelchair, my family came in like a task force to help us and help my husband. And you have to keep in mind, too, that when I started using the wheelchair, we had a newborn in the house as well. We had an 8-month-old. So my husband very quickly became a single dad to an infant. And because, I wasn't able to walk or help. And so, anyways, I am going off on a tandem. But needless to say, I've had lots of good conversations. That's my point, is I've had lots of amazing and wonderful conversations with my relatives and family, and have had the opportunity to do that. And there's one significant moment that really stuck out. She didn't know I'm going to talk about this, but with my grandmother. And I remember her talking one day. It was a really just laid-back conversation like we do. And she was in another room busybodying, and I was in another room busybodying, and we were just chatting. But I remember her saying, I don't know which is easier. In her case, a father who was present, but always questioning if he loved her. And rightfully so. I was scared of the man. I don't know much about him because I avoided him like the plague. He wasn't nice, and I'm referring to my grandmother's dad, my great-grandpa. I was scared of the man. He was scary, and it was evident in the way she communicated that it wasn't a safe place at home either. But she compared that against, if that's better, to my case where just there's no father present, which is better, But it was in those moments that, the Lord was really reminding me of these things while I was seeking the Lord and really understanding, what is influencing me, or what has influenced me. And the Lord was really revealing things like that to me that I had pressed down or I'd forgotten, or I didn't even see significant at that time. But those are the lies that we believe in our upbringing, right? That's normal, or that's just the way we are. There's a lot of shaking of heads. And so it's so easy to just be comfortable there and be comfortable in that easy, familiar place. That's how I was raised. That's what I know. That's how it is. But I also see that entertainment is an avenue for that as well. And, this one's hard right now, too, because we have a 13-year-old, and I'm at the point where I've already told you, my extremely intelligent, smart husband has utilized every way to combat bad things from coming in our home. I'm at a point where I'm like, I want a firewall. I don't care how much it costs. I don't even know what that means or what that's going to provide to me, but it feels like it gives me more control. But entertainment is a big problem. It also it influences you. It influenced me very much so. And I was really finding in these moments that I had taken this cinematic approach and applied it to my life as reality. And, my mom was an amazing woman of three wonderful and resilient adults now. And it just felt like we were surviving in our childhood in some moments. And there were no limitations to entertainment. And it took me 37 years to come to know and see that the makeup of some of the TV shows were why I believed what I believed and how I carried myself in my career. I admired how, and think about some of your favorite TV shows as I bring this up, because I was recognizing I admired how TV shows made the bosses seem so respected and honored, but I also, in a 30-minute to 45-minute to hour show, you only see pieces, right? But a TV show will capture just an entire career, and so I recognized that was the person that I was finding my worth in when I was working and in my career. I just thought that employment made me successful, and I used entertainment to create that reality. So, given all of those revelations, I just began to seek the Lord on who God said I am. Who am I despite all the influences generationally and entertainment-wise? What skills do I have following my career? What newfound understandings did I have following all of, childhood trauma impacts that impacted me so deeply? But it was evident to me, in these practices that I was so stuck on worldly things. And that's ultimately where we find ourselves comparing and coveting other things, is when we get stuck on the world and what everyone else has and what the world's providing to us. And another that I'm really struggling with the 13-year-old is what society tells us we're supposed to identify with. Why do I have to identify with that? Why do I have to pick an identity, right? Our identity is in Christ, so who does he say I am? But I was finding that I desired so much for maybe an unblemished childhood, maybe one where my legs worked. These were the things that I was finding I was spending time and allowing my mind to dwell on. One where I could do things easier. But heck, what is normal though? That's kind of where I was coveting and where I was striving to be is normal. And I really struggled with that word too, because is anybody normal? We all are finding ourselves in situations where my home doesn't look like hers. Is that normal? Or I didn't communicate the same way she did. Is that normal? And the thing about it is we're all created uniquely. And for me, I started reflecting on the fact that I don't want to be normal. Normal's pretty darn boring, don't you think? And what I was finding is I wanted to be approachable, right? I wanted to be relatable. I wanted to be real. But I also wanted to be the person that glorifies God. I wanted to be a Proverbs 31 woman. I wanted to be a woman of excellence. And what I'd been striving for was merely basic. Just boring, basic, normal. But I was finding I too coveted easy. I was coveting familiar. I was coveting what I saw on TV. In Deuteronomy 4:4-8, the Lord reminds the Israelites, "But you who have remained faithful to the Lord your God are all alive today. Look, I have taught you rules and ordinances as the Lord my God has commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to possess. Carefully follow them," meaning the rules, "for this will show your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the people. When they hear about all these rules, they will say, This great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call him? And what great nation has righteous rules and ordinances like the entire law set before you today? So I read this with the interpretation collectively that God had such a defined vision for the Israelites. And he set them apart. We too must seek God's vision in our lives. As I sought the Lord over this phase in my life, I began to quantify who I was. I had a greater desire to be active in our community. And in my career, I had the privilege of serving every community in DFW, except for the one I lived in. No exaggeration, and it always, it burdened me. It really drove me crazy because I literally was all over DFW, even in Central Texas. And every single time where we lived, the county we lived in was excluded from that, and it always really was a strain on me, and I always really, really desired to be here at home. And so I really started honing in on that, and I knew I had a heart for those that worked in healthcare. I had worked a very long career in that environment. I was comfortable in it. I'm also a patient in it, so I very much so had a desire to connect with people navigating their diagnosis. And by far, the boldest discovery was that I was ready to talk about my diagnosis, my chronic illness that I navigate. And I'd never embraced that yet. It took me a while to get there. But in turn, I've found myself in some wonderful, wonderful roles within our community. I supported a student here locally at the high school. I volunteer locally here at the hospital. I've got some of my friends here that I've had the privilege to get to know, and I enjoy them very thoroughly. But I also began partnering with the National MS Society in working more closely with those that have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, but also leading a support group here locally for individuals navigating that environment. But I found myself in a really wonderful and beautiful place with the Lord after really seeking him for what my purpose was in this season. But in addition, the Lord really stretched me, and I've fought it so hard with every reasoning and why I was not the girl for that. But obviously I lost the argument, and I do now host a podcast. She's a hazard to herself, and I am the hazard. I am very much accident prone, and sometimes not my fault, but it's a place where I get to connect with others who are navigating a very, very dry season in their life and find themselves in the wilderness navigating a chronic illness. And furthermore, I prayed to be more active here at Harvest Hill Church, and my idea of this looked so much different. It looked like a task behind the scenes, like maybe during the week I'd work on things, and look where the Lord put me. This was beyond what I would have anticipated and where my imagination allowed me to take myself. So here's the thing. The happiest people do not have less problems. They just understand their purpose. And Scripture consistently supports that when God calls someone, he sends them to the wilderness. Moses, the Israelites, David, Elijah, the Apostle Paul, even Jesus, they all experienced the wilderness. We easily look at the wilderness as abandoned, neglected, a wasteland. And it sometimes feels that way too. But it is also a place for God to redirect you towards your purpose. That's what seeking his vision looks like. Everyone has hardship. We choose where we put our energy. And it's no shocker that we find ourselves in the wilderness. We'll be tempted to turn away from Christ, and life is going to disappoint us. I mean, people are going to fail us. Hardship is inevitable. There's no exceptions to that. But to break through that cycle, and I personally believe to be set free, we must practice consistent thanksgiving. We must practice everyday thanksgiving. And here's the thing. That sounds really fluffy, right? Like it's just like this easy thing. And if you're like sitting there going, yeah, right. Like it's a habit. It's hard. I mean, to practice that every single day. And we've already established that we have to put the effort in. We have to make the action that's required towards that. But I believe that practicing everyday thanksgiving will allow us to embrace the wilderness. In fact, I was kind of on the struggle bus prepping for this conference. There's a lot that I had to put into place to prepare, meaning when I'm going to rest, how much time I'm going to spend on that. Oh, wait, but I was finding the way I thought I needed to do things to prep was required, and there was a lot of pivoting. Maybe lots of apologies to the family, for my overreaction some days, or just overwhelming struggles that I was encountering. But I believe we all encounter those things. We might find it in seasons. We might find it in events, lifetime events. But with my illness, I wake up in a different body on a daily basis. And what I do is I tend to take an assessment. And this is, if you have an imagination, this is a laying in bed assessment that I have just began to practice. It's a physical audit. Like, is everything working? What can I feel? What's it going to be like? And some days it results in like excitement. And then other days it's just, it can be sometimes bitter. Because old girl isn't always dependable. But you can imagine all of that collectively, there's a mental impact with that. And I'm going to insert just a little blurb, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. One of our afternoon speakers is going to dive deeper into grief, but I think it's important to set boundaries around grief. Because this little practice that I do every day, there's a mental impact to that, but I think there's importance to evaluate what that looks like. Given any scenario, I think it's important to identify how long you're going to spend grieving. Make a point to identify what you're grieving over, whether that's in the wilderness, or if it's just a life event or a small moment. Make a point to identify how long you're going to spend grieving, whether it be a day. I mean, in my case, I'll admit there's some scenarios that I have a rough doctor's appointment. I give myself the rest of the day to cry and wallow and Band-Aid with tacos and coffee and all my favorite things. But I know at the end of the day, like, that's the wrap. We're on to happier places tomorrow. But I think it's important to identify a timeline around that. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck there. You're going to get stuck in your self-pity, wallowing over something that's not meant for you to burden. We have an afternoon speaker diving way deeper into grief, so I'm going to move on from that. But most importantly, I also believe it's vital to fix your thoughts on all the successes that he has done in your life and praise him always, both in the past, the present, but also in the future. And I think it's interesting, very interesting, that in the 4 books where the Israelites are in the wilderness, thanks, thanksgiving, gratitude, gratefulness are never major topics. Like there's none of that. Like I checked multiple times because, again, I want to make sure I'm providing you accurate information, but there's only one subtle reference, and it's related to a sacrifice. And we don't see in general at all in the wilderness any reflection on that. It isn't until post-wilderness journey that Asaph, a descendant of the Levite clan, which was a minority, he wrote several psalms while he was reflecting on the events of the generation. So in Psalm 78, 10 through 11, he says, speaking of the Israelites, they did not keep God's covenant, and they refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wondrous works he had shown them. He praises the Lord, and this is Asaph. He praises the Lord, and he's teaching them that God is worthy of thanksgiving. Additionally, later, King David, in Psalms 95, 1 through 2, he says, "Come, let's shout joyfully to the Lord, shout triumphantly to the rock of our salvation. Let's enter his presence with thanksgiving. Let's shout triumphantly to him in song." He outlines praise, worship, and thanksgiving. So I believe to fight our human nature, to covet others, to compare ourselves to the things of the world, and in my case, just yearn simply for normal, we do have to enter his presence with thanksgiving. Remember when we reviewed the 10 Commandments, and I said earlier, he's curating a relationship with him and preparing them for the next season of life? Never once did the Israelites capture that frame of mind. But this might look like recognizing a negative thought and then glorifying God in that same moment with the replaced thought. So in my case, instead of dwelling on the fact that I'm a burden to the ones that I love the most, I in turn thank him that I have such wonderful people in my life that speak life to me, that are invested in caring for me or provide me so much grace. I have so much to be thankful for. That's what I dwell on. That's what I spend my time thinking about. But instead of focusing on the prognosis of this is just going to become a more crippling situation for me, I express gratitude for the abilities that I have today and the functions that I currently possess. I mean, even in working through this, I found myself thinking, and why me? Wondering why me, right? Even with this disease, why me? But really pressing in, I'm like, well, why not me? Hello, why not me? Like, I'm here, arms wide open. Why not me? But in fact, even prepping this section, I was finding myself getting additional tasks piled on this week, and I sat in my car Wednesday morning wondering, how the heck I was going to find the time to do these things that I have invested myself in, and I was just so uncertain about the timeline, and I quickly began to recognize in that same setting, my thoughts were going down the wrong avenue, and I seized that mindset and began to express gratitude that I still had value to add to these avenues in my life. Everyday thanksgiving is our foundation to victory. So I want to recap really quickly because I strolled through a lot of scriptures and rapid-fired a lot of things, but the 4 things I want you to take away today are: we must embrace the wilderness because we're all crippled in some form. Evaluate what has and is influencing you. What's familiar is not always right. Must seek God's vision. It's uncomfortable when we grow. And we must practice everyday thanksgiving. Our gratitude drowns out the distractions. Look for evidence that God is on your side. But we must refuse to allow the enemy to steal our joy. And in my lifetime, I can't imagine how many times I'm going to repeat these 4 steps. And they may not even all be together. They may be separated. It may just be my everyday subtle thanksgiving. But I am going to live on these 4 practical principles. So I want you to ask yourself, am I just waiting on the end? Or do you want to get control of your mindset and thrive today? So if you remember, I gave you 2 cards. So we're going to take one of those cards, one that you have jotted down, those rattling around thoughts, anything that came to mind that annoys you or burdens you or distracts you from where you know you should be. And we're going to leave those at the altar today.